I don't have any sort of formal presentation prepared for this. My thought was just to kind of give the background, explain the context of the course in which it happened, and tell you a bit about how it fell out and what I perceived as the consequences, though it's hard to get much in the way of robust cause and effect here without any controls. This was for a combined undergraduate-graduate seminar that I gave in the winter term of 2012, and it was on the epistemology of testimony, broadly speaking. The idea behind this was to work through some of my own papers that were in progress and give students a background on other parts of other regions of the literature as well. So it ranged from a kind of primer level stuff, but also getting, because my own work is on specific elements of the literature, also getting into some fairly detailed toing and froing on things. The class was about 2/3 to 1/3 undergrads, senior undergrads to graduate students. The undergrads outnumbered the grad students, but it was, and with a total of maybe 12 or 13 students altogether. And it was a pretty good class in terms of attendance, but especially at the outset, maybe a little on the quiet side, including some of the grad students, right? It's not like the grad students were in owning the show. Some of the grad students who were involved were, by their nature, a little bit more reticent, had to be drawn out a little. And my perception, at least, was that part of their reticence stemmed from the fact that 4 items on the syllabus were my own work. And this was work in progress. This is work that had not appeared in print yet. So we read some of the antecedents in the literature, and then we started reading some of my stuff. Probably not surprising that even though I was trying to elicit discussion on my own work in the class, there wasn't a lot in the way of critical commentary, right? The students found what I was writing to be, at least said they found it to be very plausible. They couldn't think of objections to it, or if they thought they had objections, they thought I had already anticipated them and ruled them out. So obviously that was great. They agreed with me without exception, and everything was perfect. 2 of those papers were at the time under review, and one of the papers came back with an R&R while the course was ongoing and after we'd already read it in class. In fact, just after we'd read it in class. And the students' response to the paper had been, yeah, well, that's just obviously right. Just great paper, obviously. And this, I think, is unsurprising. From the students' perspective, they're reading faculty members' research work. They're accustomed to the idea of their profs being right about things. It's written at a level of sophistication and detail that strikes them as having all the hallmarks of academic work as they're accustomed to reading it. And of course, they haven't seen any of the process that led to it, right? They're reading a draft of it, and it says that it's a draft, but of course, it's one thing to be told that something is a draft, and it's another thing to have seen all the drafts that came before and witnessed all the boneheaded things that it used to say and that have been taken out. So when the R&R came in for the paper in question, which is called Non-Inferentialism and Testimonial Belief Fixation, I was, of course, very pleased. It was positive R&R in many respects, but it also made some some non-trivial criticism, right? There was a non-trivial criticism of various sorts at various levels. And it struck me that this might be a teaching opportunity, a teaching and learning opportunity, precisely to address that kind of uncomfortable silence, uncomfortable for me at least, when I solicited feedback from the students about the papers that I'd given them, and they were really reluctant. Well, I wouldn't even say, I don't want to read too much into their motivation. I don't say that they were reluctant. I actually don't think they were reluctant. I think they didn't see themselves as enfranchised to think about what really could go wrong or what could be wrong with it, right? That seeing the paper as a professor's work almost precluded seeing it with a particularly critical eye, especially for the undergrads. So I thought maybe we could address this by telling them about some of the criticisms and working through it. And then I thought, well, why just tell them about them? Why not just bring in the referees' reports and show them the referees' reports? And as soon as I thought that, I immediately got this cold feeling all over, and I thought, oh no, that would be the worst thing to do. It really is, just kind of, there's a very kind of naked feeling to contemplating the idea of seeing your position in the class as the oracle reduced to that of anonymous, this is kind of, obviously we're talking extreme stereotypes, but reduced to kind of anonymous supplicant, right? That you've sent your work off saying, please find this good enough to publish, and somebody else has looked at it and said, well, here are the things you have to do before this is publishable, right? And you really do put yourself in the position of the student, submitting their work to the professor and hoping that everything turns out okay. That was, at first, felt like a very risky thing, but not for very long, I have to say. After reflecting on it for just a few minutes, it seemed to me that was precisely the reason to do it, because it would show them, by analogy, something about the process that I was asking them to do, and that, in fact, I think we all typically ask them to do, to explain to them, to show them the continuity between what they were doing for me in the class and what my research development looked like as well. Just a little bit of background about the topic, just so you can maybe understand a little bit about what's going on here. The paper in question, on the paper on which these referee comments applied, was a paper dealing with a much discussed and seemingly very important distinction in contemporary epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. And it's a distinction that's supposed to hold between beliefs or knowledge that is justified inferentially, justified because of its inferential antecedents, right? That it's the result of an inference that had correct premises and the inference was conducted cogently, and beliefs or knowledge that are justified because of just the reliability, you might say, of the process that generated them. So that no inference had to take place. There was just some sort of psychological phenomenon resulted in a belief being generated, but it wasn't an inferential one, which is to say it didn't involve logical inferences over structured propositions that are represented somehow in your mind or in your brain, depending on your level of analysis here. They're just processes. Stuff happens, bing, you get a belief. And if the stuff that happened is appropriately, reliably connected to facts of the matter, the belief is appropriately justified. So those are non-inferentially justified beliefs. So there's a kind of an ambiguity here, because you can talk both about the processes being inferential or non-inferential, and you can talk about the justification that's attendant on those processes being inferential or non-inferential. So there's a distinction that kind of applies at two different levels. Various people have taken non-inferential justification to characterize beliefs or knowledge, say, that involves things like self-knowledge or perceptual knowledge. That, coming to believe that something in front of you, say, is a red apple, isn't a matter of inferring anything from premises. There are just some sort of perceptual processes that go on that generate this belief. Or self-knowledge, right? Belief that you are now thinking about the fact that it's Tuesday, right? You don't necessarily run through an inference to do that. Many people have found it plausible that that's non-inferential. I was considering the prospect that beliefs that we form on the basis of testimony might be non-inferential, which some people have suggested. The more I thought about it, the more I thought that that can't possibly be right. And the more I thought about the reasons why it couldn't possibly be right, the more I came to doubt the prospect that there even is a very meaningful distinction between inferential and non-inferential, at least for these really complicated kinds of beliefs, like these socially freighted beliefs like testimonial beliefs. Maybe not for any of them, but I didn't tackle that question. But at least for these testimonial beliefs, I don't think there's much of a difference. And that's what that paper was arguing. Okay. And it tried to argue some other stuff too. So in the first iteration of this paper, I made the argument both for this causal notion, right, the processes, and also the justification. So at both levels, I tried to make the argument. And that turns out to be relevant to the comments. So that's sort of the background there. So my experience was that it was a little embarrassing. It was a little embarrassing. It would be a mistake to say, oh, as soon as I decided that this was worth doing, I stopped worrying about how the students would react to me seeing some of the criticisms. But that did fade fairly quickly, and after a week or so, it was no problem. Partly because I really developed the sense that this was something that was worth doing. This was the right thing to do, and that they were learning something really important that way. So how did I do it? Well, there were two referees' reports, or actually there's one report from an associate editor and one report from an external referee. And that's in the handout, the stapled handout labeled Associate Editor's Report. So I went through the two reports and I tried to identify common themes. And I labeled them in terms of problems, which I numbered using a P, and lessons for the class and for me to learn. So there are P's and there are L's. And I used this numbering system so that we could, by looking at both of the reports, identify common elements between them. And then at the end of the document, as you can see on the last page there, there's a list of 4 problems, 4 main problems that both referees were zeroing in on, and 4 main lessons to take away from this exercise. So as you read through, you can see I'm bold-facing the things that I'm labeling or numbering either as problems or as lessons. And then I'm, at the end, writing them out. So the main problems that the two referees agreed on were that the exact nature of the problem isn't spelled out sufficiently clearly. Anybody ever write that on a student's paper or project, right? There the referees were saying, oh, you need a clearer statement of what you're up to here. Yeah, that's a good point. I think I've told people that a few times myself. Robert Audi's view, who's one of the people that I was engaging, needs to be described more precisely, and it has to be situated relative to the problem the paper proposes to diagnose. So, I was saying a few things about Audi, but I had a few quotes and then a lot of interpretation of the quotes. So the comments in a few places, so for instance, on page 1, about halfway down, right? The author needs to convince us that this is indeed what Audi is doing. And there are no passages cited that indicate Audi is doing that. So, this is a challenge that had to be met 2 ways. One of the ways was by providing more in the way of primary quotes from Audi, but the other way to address it was to jettison the part of the paper that tried to show that the problem was not just with causal non-inferentialism, but also with epistemic justificational non-inferentialism. Now, I think that argument can be made, but this was the referees doing me a great favor and helping me hew closer to the MPU, right? The minimal publishable unit. So, in fact, I am going to make that argument, but I'll do it in a different paper. So it is arguable but I won't do it here. And so that's an invitation that point to the problem 2 invites me to make. Problem 3, the paper isn't sufficiently clear on how causal and epistemic factors interrelate here. So again, have we ever written this on a student's paper, right? You've got these things going on all the way through your paper. It's never really clear how they're talking to each other, right? I could have written that on the margins of a second-year student's paper. I'm getting it from a referee perfectly reasonably. And that, again, was something that I addressed by getting rid of the epistemic part of the program. And the nature and scope of my rejection of the inferential, non-inferential distinction has to be made really, really clear. Because in the first draft of this, I hadn't entirely made it clear whether I was arguing against this distinction always and everywhere, or whether I was just doing it for the testimonial case. And exactly, was I talking just about the causal, or just about the epistemic, or about both of them? So really clarity at every level. So I think this was useful for them to be able to see how those 2 referee reports fit together. Maybe the more interesting part that came out of looking at these things were the lessons, though, right? So, yeah.
Just a question. So did you give your analysis to them with the referee reports, or did they get the referee reports before they saw your analysis?
I gave them the referee reports, and then the next class I gave them, right? So one week I just gave them the reports. The next class I said, I'll try to organize this a bit just to make it easier to understand what's going on and to show you what I think matters in this. But, yeah. But in no case did I just give them the summary, right? I gave them the raw stuff one week, and then the next week I gave them this with the bold-facing and everything. So, things that I loved about these referee reports, which are, I think, very thorough, very conscientious, extremely helpful. We can see this in, for instance, the second paragraph, right? I don't think the author has conflated these 2 things, but neither is he or she at all explicit about the exact connections between them, right? So this is a journal referee who's read the paper, been left unclear on how these things fit together, but has seen through to say, all right, this is unclear, but I think there's something smart going on here. It's got to be fixed, rather than saying, this is unclear, right? Pack this up, get rid of it. This is a journal with a very low acceptance rate. I don't want to waste my time doing this. So this is a great example of comments on the work that are intended to, not just intended as a filter to publication, but are clearly intended to help the work. And so it's a lovely, it's an uncompromising diagnosis of a problem, but intellectually very generous at the same time. So when I read stuff like that, right, so I'm happy to help them out by pulling out what I take to be common themes between the 2 reports with these P1, P2. But for me, for the students, I was really keen to do things like highlight that and say, look what's going wrong here, right? So for me, right, the lesson is, right, as the author, my lesson is, it's not enough that I haven't made any mistake, as it turns out, right? What matters is that I've got to express myself in this really clear way. But the meta lesson that I described to them over top of that was, look how great these comments are, right? Look what this referee is doing for me, right? How this isn't, a nasty criticism. It's not intended to say my work doesn't belong here. This is intended to help me. It's an invitation for me to improve the thing. And so that was really the kind of point that came out all the way through in talking about the lessons. And in particular, lesson 3, that comes to the fore, that, as an external reader, the way to do it right is to be careful and rigorous, but also sympathetic, also to be charitable. And that was also an opportunity to emphasize that it doesn't matter, right? That the appropriate response to this is not to say, oh, no, I did get that right. no, I didn't make that mistake. I was right about that. But the appropriate response is to say, well, this clearly smart, intellectually generous person read it and didn't get it. And that's on me, period, right? It's got to be better if the person didn't get it. There's no such thing as saying, well, it's good as far as clarity goes, and the problem was an uptake of the clarity. Uptake is the reality here, and if there was a failure of uptake, especially from 2, then you really do have to fix it. Okay, so that was how I ran through this. After doing that, I drafted a couple of responses and ran the responses past the class as well. And the challenge to them was, how well do you think this addresses these problems? And immediately, right, after seeing this, their feedback became much richer, much more detailed, and much more willing to say, well, you're getting close, but I still think there's a ways to go. And I didn't keep track of that feedback, unfortunately, but it was dramatic, a dramatic difference. What I did keep track of was something that was this other set of handwritten comments. So what was the payoff of doing it this way, as far as I can tell? So in this class, what I had the students do was to present a draft of their paper as a conference-style presentation to the group. And everybody else in the class had to fill out one of these report sheets anonymously, which they would then I would gather them up and hand them over to the presenter. So they, with a group of anywhere from 10 to 14 in the class, they actually got a fairly rich set of comments through this style of feedback. But I went first, just to sort of show them what was going on, and asked them to do it for me. And the comparison between the kinds of feedback and their willingness to say, here's what I would have liked to have heard, here's where things were a little weak. The comparison between that feedback and what I was getting at the start of the class was night and day, right? If I had done this at the start of the class, and this, of course, causally, this is a fraught counterfactual, but I'm hoping you'll trust my recollection of how things went at the start of the class. But I think if I had done this at the start of the class, I would have heard nothing negative, and these would have just been overflowing with plaudits. But in fact, what did I get? Well, I would have appreciated further clarification and explanation. This was on a different paper, by the way. But, explain why social convergence can alter memory. Seems like a large assumption. Does being primed really change sense experience? These are good questions, and they're framed as genuine challenges to things that I said. I would have liked to know what philosopher takes the position that either you're telling the truth, or you're incompetent, or you're lying seriously, right? So this is a paper I was giving where I was talking about the richness of psychological explanations and linguistic explanations that can accommodate, that can account for the fact that groups of people can converge on false testimony. So you can get groups of people who come to agree on something that's false, sometimes something that's just ragingly, outrageously false. And when you look at the richness of the kinds of explanations that support that, you have to give up the idea that either people are telling the truth, or they're liars, or they're just lunatics or massively incompetent, right? That there are all sorts of ways that perfectly competent, perfectly sincere people can, by the cumulative effect of slippage, you might say, come to say things that are just false. And they'll say it with all the hallmarks of sincerity, and they'll have one another for mutual backing. Oh, well, here's a really nice way of framing the challenge to say, well, all right, maybe, but is this actually disagreeing with any position that's out there, right? That's a great question. That's a great question. Not because it's impossible to answer, but because it's something that really should be in there. Even if my claim is, I don't take myself to be addressing any philosopher who actually claims this. I'm saying this is, when you look at the way people roll, it's clear that something like that kind of trilemma is in the background of their reasoning. I have to say that explicitly. So that's a lovely challenge. I would have liked to know who takes this position seriously. Right? That I think is a challenge I would never have gotten. Never have gotten before I ran these referee reports past them. Maybe some streamlining is in order. Oh, went a little over time. That's great. Yeah, because there were time limits for this. And I went about 5 minutes over, and somebody watched the clock and made that. I mean, that takes a bit of, yeah. Hey, hold me to the time limit, hold yourself to it, buddy. Awesome. That's fabulous. A dry run would have been profitable. What great advice. Really, what great advice. That's just straight up good advice that one student would give to another student. There are a couple of people saying, oh, I didn't have anything to complain about. I felt as though there was too much attention placed on absolving the testifier of accusations of incompetence or nefarious motives. I'm not sure if this is reflected in the paper or if it was added in presentation, but it may be worthwhile to note it needs not be repeated after the idea is introduced. That's great, right? I mean, this was clearly a big part of what I was urging, right? But here was a student who thought that it was overkill, and that's handy. Suggestion on how to broaden it. Which one is the smiley face?
Just below the one you just looked at.
Oh.
When walking, moving, be aware that your profile isn't turned to the audience.
Well, I could just point out as another fairly husky gentleman, when people comment on our profiles, they better put a smiley face.
No, so this is, thank you so much for mentioning that. I remember noticing this. When I was a grad student, I did sample interviews. I served as a kind of guinea pig, so it wasn't for my benefit, it was for the benefit of interviewing panels, expert interviewing panels that they were developing at the University of St. Andrews. So I went in and pretended to be interviewing for a job. When they were asking me questions about my research, I did, as my dissertation supervisor was wont to do, sort of turn and look out the window and, yeah, that's an interesting sort of, and reflect on it this way. And one of the things that they said was, don't do that. Look at the people you're talking to when you're talking to them. So this, I think, is perfectly fair. I don't recall looking out the window, but I know from past experience that I have that in my repertoire. So I'm sure it's a fair cop.
All I thought was, what the hell, you got a window?
Yes. Yeah, and observations about some of my turns of phrase, or whether I was appropriately emphasizing the things that seemed most important in the talk. So I was really, really happy when I got this feedback, because I thought it presaged equally engaged feedback that the students would provide one another. And when I was aggregating their feedback for one another and looking through it, I found it was even more engaged than this. I had done peer feedback once before in a course and had found it of marginal use. And I was really on the fence about whether to do it in this class until this referee's report came through in February, which gave me time to actually change how things were going to happen at the end of the course. I was so pleased with how they were getting more engaged that I said, let's try it again. And the results were outstanding. The students' papers improved enormously between their presentation version and their hand-in version. And it was, I think, due to two things: the quality of the feedback they got from their colleagues and their sensitivity to uptake. And though, again, there's no way of proving causation here, my perception is that by modeling sensitivity to uptake and by getting them in the habit of giving rich and generous and helpful feedback, to recognize that giving critical feedback is consistent with giving helpful and welcome feedback, that was something that made a difference. And as it turns out, there's the last page of the paper when it came out. They got a thanks as a class in the footnote under acknowledgements. And I sent them the final version of the paper with the thanks to them. And several of them emailed me to say that even though their names aren't in it, that they were very pleased to see themselves thanked. So that was my experience of it. Now I just have to arrange to get an R&R in the middle of every senior undergrad seminar that I teach. That's my story.